I woke up unable to move. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't lift a single finger. But I could hear everything, the steady beep of machines, the cold smell of antiseptic. And then her voice, my own daughter's voice, the one I had held as a newborn, the one I had given everything to for my entire life. She was standing right beside my hospital bed, speaking to her husband, like I was already a body in a casket. "When he's gone," she said, calm as a woman reading a grocery list, "everything will be ours. The house, the pension, all of it." Her husband didn't even bother to whisper. He smiled. I couldn't see it, but I felt it in his voice. "I can't wait, baby." I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and face them. But my body was a prison, and I was trapped inside it, fully conscious, completely paralyzed, listening to my own child plan my funeral while my heart was still beating. Then a third voice entered the room. Sharp, quiet, absolute. The nurse checking my IV slowly looked up at them and said, "He can hear everything you're saying." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. I could not move. I could not speak. But something inside me that had been terrified became something cold and certain and unstoppable. They thought I was dying. They thought it was over. They had no idea it had just begun. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because what comes next will take you through betrayal so deep it will make your chest ache, and deliver a moment of justice so complete, so earned, and so long overdue that you will feel it in your bones. My name is Elliot Morse. I am 72 years old, a retired postal worker who spent 30 years walking the same routes through the same neighborhoods in Maple Ridge, Connecticut, learning the rhythms of other people's lives, one front porch at a time. Since my wife Dot passed 2 years ago, my life had become quieter than I ever expected. Mornings in the garden, she planted afternoons at the senior center playing chess with men who remembered the same decades I did. And evenings in a house that still smelled faintly of her perfume if I sat very still and didn't think too hard about it. I was not a man waiting to die. I was a man learning slowly and imperfectly how to keep living. And then one Tuesday morning, without warning, my body simply stopped cooperating. The first thing I became aware of was the beeping, steady, mechanical, indifferent to whatever was happening inside me. Then the smell, that particular combination of antiseptic and recycled air that belongs only to hospitals. I tried to open my eyes and found I couldn't. Tried to lift my hand and felt nothing respond. For a long moment I was convinced I had died, that this was some gray waiting room between one world and the next. Then a woman's voice cut through the fog, calm and professional, and I understood I was still very much alive. "Mr. Morse, I'm Dr. Solis. You've had what we call a thanks in advance, a transient ischemic attack, a minor stroke. The good news is that you are going to make a full recovery. Right now, your brain is completely intact and functioning. You can hear me, you can understand everything I'm saying, but your body needs time to reconnect. It's a temporary condition called locked-in syndrome. I need you to try to blink for me if you understand." I focused everything I had on my right eye. For a long moment, nothing. Then the smallest flutter, like a moth wing against glass. "Perfect," she said. "Rest. You're going to be fine." Her footsteps faded, and the word "fine" hung in the darkness behind my closed eyes, like a joke no one had bothered to explain to me. I was a conscious man inside a body that had become a sealed room, fully awake, fully aware, and completely unable to do a single thing about it. I don't know how long I lay there in that strange suspension between thought and movement before I heard the door open a second time. 2 sets of footsteps, lighter than the doctor's, carrying a different kind of weight. "Is he unconscious?" My daughter Renata's voice, and something about the way she said it, flat, clinical, almost hopeful, made something cold move through me even before I understood why. "Looks like it," her husband Conrad said. "They've got him on some serious meds." Then Renata, moving closer, close enough that I could sense her, standing right beside my bed. "Good. We need to talk." What followed were the words that rearranged everything I thought I knew about the 40 years I had spent being her father. She mentioned the funeral home on Route 9 already. She talked about the house on Maple Ridge being worth close to $500,000. She told Conrad she had been going through my files and calculated my savings, my investment accounts, my life insurance policy, and the total came to just under $1 million. And with me gone, their debt would disappear, and they could finally, in her exact words, Breathe. Conrad said he couldn't wait. He said it the way a man says it, when he means it completely. I lay there, my chest full of something I could not name and could not release, listening to my daughter divide up the life I had built the way you divide up furniture after a move. There was no grief in her voice, no conflict. There was only arithmetic. Then a third voice entered the room, and it did not belong to arithmetic at all. "Excuse me." The nurse's tone was not loud, but it was absolute. "He can hear everything you're saying. Every single word." The silence that dropped over that room was the heaviest thing I had felt in 2 years, heavier even than the morning I buried Dot. I heard Renata begin to construct an explanation, something about being practical, being prepared, and I heard the nurse cut through it with a single word. Out. Hurried footsteps, the door closing. Then a hand, warm and steady, came to rest on mine. "I'm Cecile, Mr. Morse," she said quietly, "and I promise you I won't let them hurt you." But as the room settled into silence, I became aware through the narrow slit of my barely open eyes that the door had not closed all the way. Renata was still standing in the gap, looking back at me one final time. Her eyes were not guilty. They were not afraid. They were patient and empty, and already decided the eyes of someone who had been waiting a very long time and was perfectly willing to wait a little longer. The hours that followed existed in a kind of suspended silence that I had no way to measure. There were no windows in my line of sight, no way to track whether it was day or night, only the unchanging rhythm of machines and the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Cecile checked on me regularly, adjusting my IV, speaking in that calm and grounding voice that kept me tethered to something real. By the second day, I could blink deliberately. By the third, I could turn my head a fraction of an inch. My body was waking up in small increments, like a house coming back to life after a long power failure. But my mind had not stopped running since the moment I heard my daughter's voice, and the place it kept returning to, the place it could not leave alone, was Dot. My wife had tried to warn me. I understood that now with a clarity that felt like something breaking open in my chest, not violently but slowly, the way old wood finally gives way under a weight it has been holding too long. It was roughly 4 years ago, about 6 months after Renata had married Conrad, and Dot and I were having coffee at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, the way we had done for 4 decades. She set her mug down carefully and said, "Elliot, something is different with Renata. It's the way she talks about money now. Everything is about what things cost, what people are worth, what she should be receiving." I told her it was natural. I told her that newly married couples felt financial pressure, that Renata was just adjusting to a new life, that we should be patient. Dot looked at me with those steady brown eyes of hers and shook her head. "Last week I caught her going through my purse," she said. "She told me she was looking for a tissue. But my wallet was open, Elliot. It was open, and she had been inside it." I said there was probably a simple explanation. I said Dot was reading too much into things. I was wrong. I was wrong in the particular way that a man is wrong when he loves 2 people and cannot bring himself to believe that one of them is capable of what the other one is telling him. Dot was not finished. She told me she had been noticing for several months that her heart medication looked different. She took a pharmaceutical-grade supplement. Her cardiologist had recommended the kind that cost $60 a bottle and had to be ordered through the pharmacy. She had been relying on Renata to pick it up for her because her own driving had become unreliable. What she discovered after paying closer attention was that Renata had been swapping the bottles, replacing the prescription-grade supplement with a $5 generic from the drugstore and pocketing the difference each time. "Same label," Dot said. "Different pills." That evening I confronted Renata, and what came back at me was a wall of outrage, so convincing, so wounded, that I backed away from it. She called Dot paranoid. She said aging was affecting her mother's memory and judgment, and that it was painful to be accused this way by her own family. She cried. She was so persuasive in her hurt that I went back to Dot that night, and God help me, I apologized. I told my wife I thought she might be misremembering. I chose to believe the performance over the woman who had never once lied to me in 44 years of marriage. Dot forgave me because that was the kind of woman she was. She had a garden she tended with patience and a Sunday school class she taught with genuine love, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was standing in, and she did not hold grievances the way smaller people do. But after that conversation, she never left her purse unattended when Renata visited. She never asked Renata to pick up her medications again. She simply adjusted quietly and without announcement, the way people do when they have accepted something they cannot yet say out loud. Now, lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, I understood what that silence had cost her. She had seen it clearly, and she had been alone in what she saw because the person who should have stood beside her had chosen comfort over truth. I was pulled from that thought by a sound I knew immediately. A soft knock, the door opening slowly, and then a voice I had not heard since before all of this began. Grandpa Bria crossed the room quickly and took my hand in both of hers. She was 15 years old, and she had her grandmother's eyes, that same direct and earnest quality that made you feel she was always telling you exactly what was true. She was crying. She told me her mother had said I wouldn't be around much longer. She said the doctors had told her family to prepare themselves. She squeezed my hand, and I managed the smallest pressure in return, just enough. She felt it and went very still. "You can hear me," she said. Then, she lowered her voice and reached into her jacket pocket for her phone. "Grandpa, I need to show you something. Mom doesn't know I have this." She angled the screen toward my face. It was a family group message thread between Renata Conrad and Renata's younger sister Noreen, who lived out in Columbus. Renata had written that my estate would need to be settled quickly, that she had already contacted a probate attorney, that the house needed to go on the market within 30 days. Noreen had responded, "Isn't he still alive? This feels premature." And Renata had answered, "He won't make it, Noreen. Trust me, this is finally our chance." Before I could process a single word of what I had just seen, the door opened again and Cecile stepped inside. She looked at Bria and said gently, "Sweetheart, give us a minute." When the girl slipped out, Cecile moved close to my bed, and her expression carried something in it I had not seen before, a careful, deliberate gravity that told me whatever came next was not going to be easy to hear. "Mr. Morse," she said quietly, "there is something I need to tell you. Something your daughter has been doing to keep you from knowing the truth about your own condition." Cecile did not sit down. She stood beside my bed with the measured stillness of someone who had decided to do something difficult and was not going to let herself be talked out of it. She reached for the medical file on the counter behind her, opened it, and held it close enough to my face that I could see the text through the narrow gap of my barely functioning eyes. Then she began to read, not the alarming language from the first night, not the worst-case scenarios that emergency room physicians include in every admission report as a matter of liability and standard protocol. She read me the actual assessment, the one my doctors had settled on after 2 full days of evaluation. Transient ischemic attack minor. Full neurological recovery expected within 2 to 3 weeks. No permanent brain damage. Cognitive function entirely intact. Prognosis excellent. She lowered the file and looked at me directly. "Mr. Morse," she said, "you are not dying. Not even close." I understood the words immediately, and the relief that moved through me was so enormous it was almost physical, almost like the first full breath after being held underwater. But it lasted only a moment, because what followed the relief was something colder and more clarifying. If I was not dying, then Renata knew I was not dying. She had access to my doctors, had inserted herself into every conversation about my care, had positioned herself as the family contact for all medical updates. She was not a panicked daughter preparing for the worst. She was a woman who understood exactly what was happening and had chosen to tell everyone around her a different story entirely. "She requested that your full prognosis not be shared with you directly, Cecile," said her voice quiet and controlled. "She told the staff she wanted to spare you unnecessary stress, and that she would handle all medical communication as your next of kin." Cecile's jaw tightened. "That is not how patient rights work. You are competent and conscious, and you have every right to know your own diagnosis. I should have pushed back harder from the beginning. I'm sorry I didn't." She paused. "What she has been showing your family are the emergency room notes from your first hour here. Every ER report includes alarming language. By default, it's how liability documentation works, and she has been presenting those initial worst-case lines as your actual prognosis. She has been telling people you have weeks, maybe less. That is not what any physician here has said since your second day." I lay with that information for a long moment. Renata had not simply been opportunistic, had not simply allowed a misunderstanding to persist. She had constructed the misunderstanding deliberately and maintained it. There was a name for what that was, and I did not want to say it to myself yet, but it was there waiting at the edge of everything I was thinking. Before I had time to move further into it, the door opened without a knock. Conrad walked in carrying a leather document folder, the expensive kind, with a brass clasp, moving with the purposeful energy of a man who had convinced himself he was running out of time. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He pulled a chair directly to my bedside, opened the folder, and spread several pages across my lap as though I were a desk. "We need to handle some paperwork, Elliot," he said, his voice carrying a forced ease that didn't reach his eyes. "Power of attorney, some insurance forms. Standard hospital procedure. It just protects everyone while you're recovering." He positioned a pen against my limp hand and tried to curl my fingers around it. "Just make a mark. That's all we need. One mark and everything is in order." Cecile stepped forward. "Mr. Calloway, your father-in-law, is not in a condition to sign legal documents. He hasn't recovered sufficient motor function to provide informed consent, and any signature obtained under these circumstances would not be legally valid." Conrad shot her a look that was impatient on the surface and something uglier underneath. "I saw his fingers move yesterday. He can grip." He pressed the pen harder into my palm and guided my hand toward the signature line. I let my hand go completely slack. The pen rolled off my fingers and fell to the floor with a small, clean sound. Something shifted in Conrad's face. "Damn it." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to something tighter, more pressurized, the sound of a man whose patience had run out some time ago. "We need this done now, Elliot. Do you understand me? Tomorrow might be too late. Stop being difficult. This is for your own protection." His hand closed around my shoulder, and he shook me once. Not hard enough to leave a mark, but hard enough to mean something, and Cecile moved between us before he could do it again. "Get out," she said. Not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. "You are attempting to obtain a legal signature from a patient who cannot give meaningful consent, and you just put your hands on him. Leave this room now, or I will call security and we will have a much more serious conversation than the one you want to be having." For a moment, Conrad held absolutely still, calculating. Then he stuffed the documents back into the folder with sharp, angry movements and left without a word. The door closed hard. Cecile locked it, then stood with her back against it for a few seconds, composing herself. She came to my bedside, took out her personal phone, and looked at me with an expression that was both exhausted and completely certain. "Mr. Morse, I need to ask you something. Is there anyone outside this hospital you trust? Anyone at all?" She held up 2 fingers. "Blink twice, if yes." I blinked twice. "Can you give me a name?" I gathered every fragment of strength I had, found my throat, found the shape of a word, and pushed air through it until it became something. It came out barely above a breath, but it was a name. "Ted." She leaned closer. "Last name?" I pushed again one more time. "Hargrove." 3 hours is a long time when you cannot move and cannot sleep and have nothing to do but think. I lay in that room, running through every possibility, every reason. Ted Hargrove might not come every way. The phone call Cecile had made might fail to reach him or find him unwilling. It had been nearly 2 years since I had seen the man. We had spoken briefly at Dot's funeral, exchanged a few words at the graveside that neither of us had been prepared for, and that had been the end of it. I had no reason to believe he owed me anything, no particular grounds to expect that a semi-retired attorney in his mid-70s would drop whatever remained of his Tuesday afternoon and drive to a hospital room on the strength of a second-hand phone call from a nurse he had never met. But Dot had trusted him with something once a long time ago, and Dot had never once trusted the wrong person. That was the thought I held onto during those 3 hours. That, and the sound of Cecile's footsteps making their quiet, regular passes outside my door. When the room door finally opened, the man who entered was moving slowly but not weakly, the measured pace of someone who chooses deliberateness over speed. He was entirely white-haired, slightly stooped at the shoulders, wearing a visitor's badge that identified him as pastoral care. To anyone watching through the door's narrow window, he would have looked like a chaplain making his rounds, an old man bringing quiet comfort to the sick and frightened. He pulled a chair close to my bed, took my hand in both of his the way you would hold a hand in prayer, and for anyone who happened to glance in, that is exactly what it would have appeared to be. His voice when he spoke was almost inaudible, barely a thread of sound, but it was steady and it was exact. "Elliot," he said. My name is Ted Hargrove. You know who I am?" I blinked twice. He nodded. "I loved Dot once," he said, and there was no apology in it, no awkwardness, just an old fact stated plainly by a man who had long since made his peace with it. "A long time ago, before you two married. She chose you. She chose right. But I never stopped caring about what happened to her or to you." He paused, and something in the set of his jaw became harder. "What your daughter is doing has a name, Elliot. Manipulating medical records, attempting to obtain legal signatures from a patient under duress, dividing your estate while you are conscious and competent. It is called elder financial abuse. In this state, it is a Class D felony. And I am not going to let it happen to you." He did not linger on the weight of that. He opened his briefcase and moved directly into what needed to be done, speaking quietly and quickly with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life turning bad situations into manageable ones. 4 steps, he told me. First, a psychiatric capacity evaluation by an independent specialist, because Renata would eventually claim I was mentally compromised, and we needed that argument removed before she could make it. Second, a revocable living trust, drafted by a colleague he already had in mind, naming Bria as primary beneficiary, structured with specific language that would be difficult to challenge. Third, a new durable power of attorney designating Ted himself as my legal agent, replacing any document that carried Renata's name. Fourth, an advance healthcare directive that removed Renata entirely from any medical decision-making authority. 7 to 10 days minimum to do it properly, he said. I know that feels like a long time. But one error in any of these documents and she will find it and she will use it. We do this right, Elliot. We do it once, and we do it so that no one can undo it. I managed to rasp out a single syllable. He understood it. As fast as we possibly can, he said. I promise you. He took out his phone and began making calls right there in the room, turned slightly away from the door, his voice low enough that the words dissolved before they reached the hallway. I listened to him work, scheduling the capacity evaluation, reaching his colleague about the trust documents, arranging for a notary, and I felt something shift in the room, some atmospheric change, as though the balance of things had finally begun to move in a different direction. Cecile slipped in once, nodded at Ted, adjusted my IV without a word, and slipped back out. She had been standing guard in the way quiet people stand guard, without announcement, without drama, simply by refusing to leave. Ted was ending his third call when the door opened with a force that belonged to a different kind of energy entirely. Renata stood in the doorway, and I watched through the thin gap of my eyes as she took in the room in a single sweeping look. The notary who had just stepped away down the corridor, Ted's open briefcase, Ted himself. The color left her face and then came back wrong. What is going on in here? Ted rose from his chair, slowly positioning himself between my bed and where she stood. I'm here as your father's legal counsel, he said. We've been reviewing his healthcare directives and estate planning. The look on Renata's face was not the look of a concerned daughter receiving unexpected news. It was the look of someone who had arrived at a door she thought was unlocked and found it bolted from the inside. She left when Cecile made clear she would involve security, her footsteps sharp and fast down the corridor. Ted and I sat in the silence she left behind, and then his phone buzzed. He read the message, looked up at me, and his expression told me everything before he said a word. That was Cecile, he said. She was on her break near the parking lot. She heard them talking. He held up his phone and pressed play, and Renata's voice filled the room, cold and completely clear. We need to move him tonight, Conrad. Before whatever he's signing goes through, there's too much at stake. We move him tonight. Ted held the phone in the air a moment after the recording ended, as though giving the words room to settle, and then he set it face down on the table beside my bed. Cecile is watching the floor, he said quietly. She'll alert us the moment anything moves. We have a little time, maybe not much, but enough for what I need to show you before tonight unfolds. He pulled his chair closer and opened his briefcase with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent the past 2 days preparing for exactly this conversation. There are things you don't know about your daughter, Elliot. Things that go back further than this hospital room, further than your stroke, further than her marriage to Conrad. You need to know them now, because understanding what she is capable of is not separate from protecting yourself. It is the same thing. He withdrew a manila folder and placed the first document where I could see it. It was a probate court record from 8 years ago filed in this county. The name at the top was Agnes Hartley, Dot's mother, my children's grandmother. A careful, undemonstrative woman who had raised Dot with a quiet and steady love that left a permanent mark on everyone who knew her. She had owned her house outright for 30 years and lived modestly and well. Renata moved in with her for the last 3 months of her life, Ted said. You and Dot were grateful. You both told Renata it was a beautiful thing she was doing. I remembered. We had praised her for it. Look at the dates, he said. 12 days before Agnes Hartley died, she signed her home over to Renata. 6 days before she died, she transferred her investment accounts totaling $115,000. 3 days before she died, Renata was added to every remaining bank account with full access. Agnes died of heart failure at 78, the death certificate, showing nothing that would draw a second look from anyone not already looking. She had been hospitalized twice in her final month, both times for what the records described as medication errors, dangerous fluctuations in her blood pressure levels. Both incidents attributed to the confusion of an elderly woman, both occurring while Renata was her sole caregiver and the only person managing her medication. Ted said nothing further. He didn't need to. He set the folder aside and reached for something smaller, a journal with a worn leather cover and a faded ribbon marking a page near the back. I recognized it before he opened it. Dot had kept that journal in her nightstand drawer for years. I had seen it hundreds of times and never read a word of it because it was hers and she deserved every private thought she ever had. Ted opened to the marked page and read aloud in a voice that was careful and low. The entry was dated 14 months before Dot died. She wrote that she believed Renata had done something to her mother, that the asset transfers had been too fast and too deliberate to reflect the genuine wishes of a confused woman. She wrote that she had no proof and could not bring herself to say it aloud to the one person who might have helped her, because that person had not believed her about the purse or the vitamins or any of the smaller things she had tried to name before they became larger ones. She wrote my name in that sentence, and hearing it spoken in Ted's careful voice was one of the more painful things I had experienced in a life that had recently not been short on pain. He turned forward several pages and read a second entry written the following spring. Dot described Renata asking increasingly detailed questions about her medications, her financial accounts, her doctor's appointments. She wrote that she recognized something in her daughter's manner, a particular quality of attention that she had noticed in the months before Agnes died, and that she was frightened in a way she could not fully articulate. Then Ted closed the journal and reached into his briefcase one final time, withdrawing a small USB drive with a care that told me everything about what it contained before he said a single word. She recorded this in my office about 8 months before she passed, he said. She said she needed to do it just in case. She asked me to keep it somewhere. Renata would never find it. He opened his laptop, inserted the drive, and turned the screen toward my face. And then Dot was there. Thinner than I remembered her toward the end, pale in the way she had always tried to conceal from me, wearing the blue cardigan I had given her for her 68th birthday. She was sitting in a chair in Ted's conference room with her hands folded in her lap, looking directly into the camera with an expression I had seen only a handful of times across 44 years together. The look she wore when she had decided something all the way down and nothing on earth was going to change it. "Elliot, my love," she said, "if you are watching this, then Renata has done to you what she tried to do to me, and I am so sorry I could not stop her while I was still there to try." She counted on her fingers the way she always did when she wanted to be certain she was understood. 4 things, exactly the 4 things Ted had already walked me through that afternoon. And I understood then that the two of them had built this together long before I had any reason to know I would need it. At the very end, she leaned forward toward the camera, toward me, and what was in her face was not grief and not defeat. It was love, with its sleeves rolled up. "Don't let her win, Elliot. She has already taken too much from us." The screen went dark. Before I could find any footing at all in what I had just witnessed, the radio on the table crackled, and Cecile's voice came through flat and stripped of everything except the necessary facts. "Ted. Conrad just walked in carrying a transport folder. He's disconnecting the monitors right now." Ted was already on his feet before Cecile finished the sentence. He tucked the laptop under his arm, dropped the USB drive into his jacket pocket, and looked at me with an expression that was not panic, but was very close to its more useful cousin. "She's watching the floor," he said. "Stay still. Let it unfold." Then he moved to the door, cracked it open, and slipped out into the hallway, and I was alone in the half-dark room with nothing to do but listen. Conrad came in less than 2 minutes later. There was no pretense left in him, no effort at the concerned son-in-law performance he had been maintaining for days. He moved through the room the way people move when they have decided that speed matters more than appearances, pulling the monitor leads from my chest with quick, practiced movements, silencing the machines before they could register. Objection. I felt the absence of those connections like a small, cold loss. "You're being transferred," he said, not to me, exactly, more to the room, to the logistics of what he was doing. Better facility. Specialized care. This is what's best. He unlocked the wheels of my bed with his foot and began to push, and I felt the floor moving beneath me, in the slow, wrong direction, out through the door and into the corridor. The hallway was dimmer at this hour. The night shift, running on reduced staffing, the nursing station 2 corridors away, and occupied with its own rhythms. Conrad moved with purpose, steering my bed toward the far end of the hall, where the service elevator waited, the one used for equipment transfers. I tried to produce sound, tried to call out, and managed only a thin rasp that dissolved before it reached the air around me. I tried to reach the call button and found it gone. Moved out of my reach at some point I hadn't noticed. The ceiling tiles passed overhead in slow, even intervals, and I counted them because there was nothing else I could do. Then Cecile stepped out of a doorway directly into our path, and she did not move. She stood with her feet planted and her phone already in her hand, and she looked at Conrad with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and is not surprised to find it arriving. "Where are you taking my patient, Mr. Calloway?" Conrad told her it was an emergency transfer, that he had family authorization, that everything was properly documented. He said it while still moving, trying to angle the bed around her, and she moved with him, staying in front, refusing the angle. "I checked the transfer log 10 minutes ago," she said. "Mr. Morse is not listed for any transport tonight. Show me the discharge paperwork right now, or I am calling security and the police simultaneously." He told her she didn't have authority over family decisions. She told him she had authority over every patient on this floor, and that he had 3 seconds to stop moving the bed. He stopped. Security arrived first, then the nursing supervisor, and then from a patient room halfway down the corridor, a uniformed officer named Ray Garrett, who had been visiting a relative on the floor, and walked out into the hallway with the alert, unhurried manner of someone trained to recognize when something is wrong without being told. Conrad produced his documents and spread them on the medication cart nearby, with the confidence of a man who has rehearsed this moment but is not adequately prepared for scrutiny. The supervisor examined each page. The hospital seal on the discharge papers was a photocopy, flat and slightly pixelated, where a genuine embossed seal would have caught the light. The notarization was issued by a Nevada notary for a Connecticut facility. The transport company listed did not appear on any approved vendor database in the county. While she was still reading, Ted appeared at the far end of the hallway, slightly out of breath, with his phone extended in front of him. The recording he played was short and completely clear. Renata's voice from the parking lot earlier that evening, saying they needed to move me tonight before whatever I was signing could take effect. Garrett listened to it twice, then looked at Conrad with the closed, certain expression of someone done asking questions. The handcuffs came out, and Conrad's protests became louder and less coherent, cycling through variations of, "I was just helping my wife," and she said it was legal, until Garrett had finished reading him his rights, and neither statement was doing any visible work. That was when Renata came through the main entrance. She had clearly seen the police car outside and arrived already, unraveling her hair loose, her composure entirely gone, and she moved through the lobby at a speed that drew every eye in the room. She grabbed at Garrett's arm, she pointed at Ted, she said things about family rights and vulnerable fathers and manipulative strangers that echoed off the walls and reached the visitors and patients in every surrounding space. Then she saw me, lying in my displaced bed in the middle of the corridor, and for one unguarded second, everything she had been performing dropped away. And what remained was not grief and not love, but something stripped and cold and ancient. Up on the second-floor balcony that overlooked the lobby, I caught movement at the railing. Bria, still in her school jacket, her hands gripping the metal, her face frozen in an expression I recognized because I had felt it myself in the last several days. The expression of a person watching something they already knew was true, become undeniably real. Garrett was steering Conrad toward the exit when Conrad stopped and turned back, and the look he gave Renata was the look of a man cutting a rope. "If I go down for this," he said loudly enough that the whole lobby heard it, "you are coming down with me. I have every text, Renata. Every plan, every instruction, all of it." The color left her face in a single wave. It was the first time since I had woken up in that hospital that I saw something genuinely new in my daughter's eyes. It was fear, and it was real, and it was entirely her own. Late that night, after the statements had been given and the paperwork filed and the floor had settled back into its regular rhythms, Cecile sat beside my bed in the low light and rested her hand over mine. "Try to sleep," she said softly. Then after a pause, "There's something I need to tell you, Mr. Morse. Something I've kept quiet for nearly 5 years. Dot didn't ask me to protect you simply out of professional duty." She stopped, drew a slow breath. "She paid me to do it." I did not ask Cecile to say more that night. I heard those 7 words and I held them the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet ready to examine carefully without pressure, aware that the full weight of it would need to wait until I was in a condition to bear it properly. She seemed to understand that without my having to communicate it. She sat with me a little longer in the low light, and then she said goodnight and left. And I lay in the quiet room with Dot's voice still somewhere in the walls from the video Ted had played, and I let myself feel fully and without management exactly how much I had underestimated the woman I had been married to for 44 years. The days that followed moved in the slow, incremental way that recovery moves when you are paying close attention to it. By the end of the first week, I could lift both arms above the bed rail. By the 10th day, I was walking the length of the corridor twice with a physical therapist named Marcus, who told me I was progressing faster than most patients my age and meant it as a compliment, which I took as one. Ted came each morning and Cecile looked after me each shift, and between the two of them I was never left without someone in my corner, which was a thing I had not fully understood I needed until I needed it completely. On the 14th day, Dr. Solis reviewed my charts, completed her assessment, and told me I was ready to go home. Ted drove me. He had arranged for a home health aide named Darnell Webb to stay on site through the initial weeks of my recovery. A quiet and competent man in his 40s who had the particular gift of being present without being intrusive. Darnell was already at the house when we arrived, and as Ted's car turned onto my street and the familiar roofline came into view above the oak trees I had watched grow for 40 years, I felt the first uncomplicated thing I had felt in 2 weeks. Something that was almost like relief, almost like coming back to myself. It lasted until I stepped through the front door. From the outside, the house looked exactly as I had left it. Inside, it looked like someone had been searching for something they believed was hidden and had not particularly cared what they damaged in the process of looking. The drawers of my office desk had been pulled all the way out and upended, their contents spread across the floor in loose drifts of paper. My filing cabinet, a heavy 2-drawer unit I had owned for 20 years, had been pried open, the lock broken cleanly and without apology. The closet in the hallway where I kept insurance documents and financial records had been emptied onto the floor of the bedroom. And on Dot's dressing table, where she had kept the small wooden jewelry box her mother gave her the year they married, the lid was open and the box was empty. She had owned almost nothing of monetary value, 3 pairs of earrings, a bracelet, her mother's watch. But they had been hers, and they were gone, and standing there looking at that open, empty box was one of the harder moments of a stretch of time that had not been lacking for them. Ted moved through every room with his phone out, photographing each point of damage in methodical sequence. "This is what we need," he said, not unkindly. She was looking for bank statements, investment records, account numbers, anything that would tell her exactly what she was fighting over. The broken lock, the ransacked files, the fact that this happened while you were in the hospital, all of it goes into the record. It shows intent, Elliot. It shows premeditation. I nodded, because he was right, and because agreeing with him was easier in that moment than talking about the jewelry box. The security company Ted had arranged arrived that afternoon and worked for 3 hours installing cameras at every entrance, motion sensors along the main corridors, and a panic button system beside my bed and in the kitchen that would alert both Ted and the local police the moment it was. pressed. I watched these strangers move through the rooms where Dot and I had lived our quiet life, and I thought about what she would have said about all of it, about the cameras and the sensors and the armed alarm panel mounted beside the coat rack where we used to hang our scarves. She would have hated it. She would have said it made the house feel like a place under siege rather than a place where people lived. She would have been right, and she would have helped me make peace with it anyway, because that was the particular combination she carried in her clear-eyed honesty and bottomless practicality. And I missed it the way you miss a compass when you are already lost. That evening I sat in her reading chair for the first time since coming home. The cushion still held the faint trace of her perfume, something light and clean she had worn for as long as I had known her, and I sat very still and did not think about anything at all for several minutes, which was its own kind of relief. On the third day home, I walked out to the garden with my cane and stood at the edge of the beds she had planted and tended for 3 decades. Now overgrown and tangled with weeds that had moved in during the 2 years, I had not known how to care for them without her. I knelt down slowly and with some difficulty and pulled a fistful of weeds out of the earth with my bare hand. It was a small and impractical gesture, and it was exactly what I needed to do. I was still there when I heard the doorbell from inside the house. I came back in and looked at the monitor for the new security camera above the front door, and what I saw on the screen stopped me completely. Bria was standing on my front porch with her school backpack still on her shoulders. She had been crying so long and so hard that the evidence of it was written across her whole face, and I understood before I had even pressed the button to open the door that she had not come to visit. She had come to tell me something she had been carrying alone for too long, something that was going to cost her everything to say out loud. She came inside and went directly to the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch with her backpack still on, as though she hadn't fully committed to staying, as though she might need to leave quickly if this went badly. I sat across from her in Dot's reading chair and I did not rush her. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was going gold and Darnell had the quiet good sense to disappear into the back of the house without being asked. Bria sat with her hands pressed flat against her knees for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, and then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone. "I need to show you something first," she said. "Before I say anything else, I need you to see this." She opened her camera roll, scrolled to a video saved in drafts, and turned the screen toward me. It was a video she had made in my living room, the kind teenage girls make for themselves, a casual dancing video recorded to some song I didn't recognize. She was in the foreground, young and unguarded and entirely herself, but the camera was wide enough to catch the kitchen doorway behind her. And through that doorway, clearly visible and clearly audible beneath the music, were 2 people in the middle of an argument that had moved past argument into something uglier. I watched Renata shove me with both hands, a deliberate and full-bodied push, and I watched myself stagger backward into the kitchen counter and go down hard. I watched Renata stand over me where I had fallen, and heard her voice come through the phone's small speaker with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "You are ruining my life. Just sign the damn papers." Bria stopped the video. "That was 2 months before your stroke," she said. "That's why your hip hurt. You told everyone you tripped, but she pushed you, Grandpa. I watched it happen and I was too scared to tell anyone, and then when you ended up in the hospital I kept thinking that if I had just shown someone this video right away, maybe none of it would have gone as far as it did." I set the phone down on the cushion beside me and looked at my granddaughter, and she looked back at me with the expression of someone who has decided to walk through something and is not going to stop in the middle of it. "There's more," she said. "I need to tell you all of it." And then she did one layer at a time, each one landing with a different weight. She told me about the email password that Renata had asked her for it months before my stroke, saying she was worried about me being targeted by online scammers, that she needed to monitor my inbox for my own protection. Bria had believed her and given it without hesitation. She told me about the signature practice that Renata had sat her down at the kitchen table one afternoon with a piece of paper and my name written on it, and told her that I was planning to leave everything to charity, that the family would be left with nothing that Bria might have to leave her school, and that they needed to be ready to protect themselves. She told me about the afternoon Renata had brought her to my house while I was still in the hospital, saying they needed to find important documents to help manage my care, and how Bria had helped her search my desk and my filing cabinet, without understanding until much later what they had actually been looking for. And then she told me the last thing, the one that made her voice drop to barely a sound at all. She had overheard a phone call weeks before my stroke in which Renata spoke to someone about how strokes could cause complications, even in patients who initially seemed stable, about how sometimes older patients declined rapidly when the right conditions were in place. I didn't understand what she meant, Bria said. I think I didn't let myself understand. But after everything that happened in the hospital, I've thought about it every single day. The room was quiet for a long time after she finished. I looked at this 15-year-old girl who had been handed a set of impossible choices by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect her from exactly that kind of weight, and I felt the anger I had for Renata locate. Something new and specific inside me, something harder and colder than anything I had felt before. Bria, I said, what your mother did to you is not something you carry alone. She told you stories that weren't true. She used your fear against you, and she put you in the middle of something a grown adult should never have involved a child in. That is on her. It is not on you. She was crying again by then, not the heaving kind, but the quiet, exhausted kind. If you want my forgiveness, I said, you do one thing. You tell the truth. In court, on the record, all of it, including the parts that are hard to say. Can you do that? She nodded without hesitation. And in that nod I saw something steady and decided that had not been there when she walked in. We were still sitting together in the lowering afternoon light when we heard tires screech outside and a car door thrown open. Then fists on my front door, heavy and relentless. Bria. Renata's voice had shed every layer of performance, and what was underneath was something raw and cornered. You gave him the video. After everything I have done for you, you gave it to him. The pounding intensified. I am your mother. You are supposed to be on my side. Bria went rigid beside me, and I moved to stand between her and the door. Through the security monitor, I watched Ted's car pull up. I watched him walk to the door with a document in his hand and inform Renata of the restraining order that had been issued and the distance she was required to maintain. She backed toward her car slowly, and before she got in, she turned and looked directly at the camera with an expression that had nothing left in it to manage. You are dead to me, Bria, she said, loud enough to carry through the walls. You hear me, dead. Her car was gone before the echo of it finished settling. Bria sat very still in the chair, dry-eyed now past the point of tears, and there was something in her face that was not broken. It was decided. That evening, close to 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Cecile, and her voice carried a quality I had not heard from her before, something shaken beneath the surface. Renata came to the hospital today, she said. She waited for me in the lobby and confronted me in front of patients and staff. She was screaming. A pause. She said she knew I was the one Dot had talked to. She knew Elliot. She has known all along. And there is something I kept quiet because Dot asked me to something I should have told you sooner, and I think we are well past the point where staying quiet is the right thing to do. Cecile came to the house the following morning. She arrived earlier than I expected, before Ted, before the physical therapist, while Darnell was still in the kitchen, and Bria was asleep on the pull-out sofa, where she had stayed the night because neither of us had suggested she leave, and neither of us had wanted her to. Cecile sat down across from me at the dining room table with her coat still on, as though she had driven over before she could talk herself out of it, and she set a plain white envelope on the table between us. It was the kind of envelope you buy in bulk from any office supply store, but it had the particular look of something that had been handled many times over several years, slightly softened at the corners, the flap resealed at some point, with a strip of clear tape. She did not push it toward me. She simply placed it there, and kept her hand flat on top of it, and told me what was inside before she let me see it. 5 years ago, she said, Dot had come to find her at the hospital. Not as a patient and not during a scheduled appointment. She had driven herself there on a Tuesday afternoon and asked for Cecile at the nursing station and waited in the corridor until Cecile came out on her break. They had known each other in the mild, intermittent way that people know each other when they live in the same town long enough. The occasional conversation at church, the familiar face at the pharmacy. Dot had never sought her out before. That afternoon she sat down beside Cecile on a bench near the hospital entrance and talked for 45 minutes without stopping. She told her about Agnes Hartley. She told her about the vitamins and the purse, and the confrontation that had ended with Elliot apologizing to the wrong person. She told her that she was not sick yet, not seriously, but that she had begun to understand with increasing clarity that she might not always be in a position to protect the person she most needed to protect. Then she had taken this envelope from her bag and placed it in Cecile's hands. Cecile lifted her hand from the envelope and slid it across the table to me. Inside was a check made out to Cecile Dawson in the amount of $10,000. The signature was Dot's neat and familiar, the same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes she used to leave on my pillow when I worked early shifts. The date was 5 years ago. In the memo line, in letters small enough to be private but clear enough to be permanent, Dot had written, "For Elliot's safety when the time comes." She told me to deposit it into a separate account and keep it there, Cecile said. Her voice was steady but only just. She said, "When something happens to me, Renata will come for Elliot next. When that day comes, I need you to be there. Use whatever is needed, lawyer fees, investigators, anything it takes. Just please keep him safe." She paused and looked at her hands. I tried to give it back. It felt like too much, like something a person accepts only if they believe the worst is certain to happen. But Dot looked at me the way she looked at things when she had already decided all the way down to the ground, and I understood that refusing it was not actually an option she was offering me. Cecile looked up. "She was your wife for 44 years, Elliot, and she spent the last years of her life making sure that if Renata came for you, someone would already be in position to stop it. That is what that check was. That is what I was." I held the check in both hands for a long time without speaking. There are things that move you past the ordinary language of being moved past what tears can adequately represent, and this was one of them. My wife had seen clearly what was coming, had been afraid in a way she could not fully share with me, and had used the last of her independent strength not to save herself, but to arrange a defense for the man she was leaving behind. I had thought I understood what it meant to be loved by Dot. I had not understood completely until that moment. Later that morning, 2 days after Bria's visit, a woman from the County Adult Protective Services office knocked on my door. Her name was Rachel Monroe, and she carried a clipboard and wore an expression that managed to be both professional and apologetic simultaneously. She explained that a complaint had been filed, alleging that I was being held against my will and lacked the mental capacity to manage my own affairs. She did not need to tell me who had filed it. She interviewed me for 90 minutes, reviewed the results of the psychiatric capacity evaluation Ted had arranged, examined the security system, and spoke privately with Darnell. When she was finished, she closed her notebook and told me the complaint appeared baseless and potentially retaliatory, and that her report would reflect that clearly. Ted watched her car leave from the front window and said without turning around that every failed attempt Renata made only added another layer to the case being built against her. That evening, a courier delivered a thick legal envelope addressed to Ted. He opened it at the dining room table and read it without expression, then set it down and looked at me. "She's filed a countersuit," he said. "She's claiming you are mentally incompetent and petitioning the court to have herself appointed your legal guardian." The words sat in the room with us for a moment. I looked at Ted. I looked at Cecile, who had stayed through dinner and was standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands. I looked out the window to where Bria was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt beside Dot's old flower beds, pulling weeds in the fading evening light without anyone having asked her to. Then I looked back at Ted and I said the only thing there was to say. "Good," I said. "So are we." The weeks between that evening and the trial date were the weeks that Ted Hargrove revealed himself most fully to me, not through anything he said about himself intentionally, but through the simple and relentless fact of his presence. He arrived each morning before 7 with coffee in a thermos and a briefcase that seemed to grow heavier with new material every time he set it on my dining room table. He built the case the way a craftsman builds something meant to last, methodically, without shortcuts, testing each element before moving to the next. He brought in a colleague named Sandra Elmore, a specialist in elder financial abuse cases, who had testified as an expert witness in courtrooms across New England, and the two of them spent an afternoon at my table mapping Renata's pattern of behavior against the documented clinical framework for financial exploitation of elderly adults, which was, as Dr. Elmore explained in her precise and unhurried way, almost a textbook match. He tracked down Conrad's attorney and began the careful strategic work of making clear to that attorney's client that cooperation would be received very differently by the court than resistance. He filed responses to Renata's countersuit that were so thorough and so specific that her attorney requested 2 extensions just to compose a reply. I watched all of this from close range, and what I noticed was that Ted did not work like a man fulfilling an obligation. He worked like a man with something to prove, not to me and not to the court, but to himself. And the quality of that particular urgency was familiar enough to me that I recognized it without being able to name it until late one night, nearly 3 weeks into our preparation, when I woke at 2 in the morning and found the dining room light still on. Ted was at the table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a highlighter in his hand, working through a stack of financial records with the focused intensity of someone who does not notice time passing. I came and sat across from him and poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher Darnell always left out, and I said nothing for a while. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the quarter hour. Ted turned a page. I watched his face in the lamplight and saw something in it that I had not allowed myself to look at directly before, a grief that was not about Dot and not about me, something older and more personal than either of those things. "Tell me about Caroline," I said. He set the highlighter down and took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heels of both hands. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said her name the way parents say the names of children they are frightened for, carefully, as though the saying of it requires protection. Caroline was his daughter. She was 42 years old. 5 years ago, she had been a practicing pediatric surgeon at a hospital in Hartford, a woman who had spent her career saving children's lives, which was the detail Ted mentioned first and returned to twice as though it were the part that made everything else most unbearable. The forgetting had started small the way it always does, and by the time she received her diagnosis, the progression was already significant. Her husband Richard had been attentive throughout, present and concerned and helpful in the way that people who want something from you can be present and concerned and helpful. While Caroline could still sign her name and understand what she was signing, Richard had persuaded her to grant him full financial power of attorney. He had framed it as practical preparation, as love expressed through logistics, and she had trusted him because she was frightened and because he was her husband. Within a year, he had liquidated her savings account, her retirement fund, and the equity in their home, moving the money in increments small enough not to trigger immediate scrutiny. He placed her in the least expensive memory care facility he could find and filed for divorce by mail. By the time Ted understood what had happened, the window for most financial crime prosecutions had already closed. Richard had been careful enough and patient enough that the law could not reach him where he had gone. "I was too busy," Ted said. "Too far away. I told myself she was managing. I told myself Richard was a good man. I did not pay the kind of attention that would have told me I was wrong." He looked at the papers in front of him. "When I see what Renata did to you, the way she isolated you, exaggerated your incapacity, positioned herself as your caretaker while systematically dismantling every protection you had, I see what Richard did to Caroline. The same architecture, the same patience, the same fundamental belief that the person they were exploiting did not matter enough to defend." He stopped. "I could not protect my daughter. I will not fail to protect you." I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm, and he let it stay there. 2 old men in a lamplit room in the middle of the night, each of us carrying a loss. The other understood without needing it explained. After a while, I told him that he was not failing anyone, that he was the reason I still had a home to sit in and a case to fight, and that Dot had chosen the right person when she chose him. He nodded once, accepting this, and put his glasses back on. 2 days later, the official trial date arrived by certified mail. 6 weeks out. Ted opened the envelope, read the papers, and set them on the table with a quietness that was not defeat, but the opposite of it. Then Cecile called from the other room with something in her voice I hadn't heard before. "Renata reached out to Noreen," she said. "She's been telling the extended family that you're being manipulated by a predatory lawyer and a nurse with ulterior motives. Noreen is spreading it." I felt something go cold and still in my chest. Then Ted said, without looking up from his notepad, "She also contacted my office this morning. She wants to meet with you privately before the trial. No lawyers, just family." He finally looked up. "I think we should agree to it." Ted explained his reasoning that same evening, and it was the kind of reasoning that only looks simple after you have already seen it from every angle. Renata believed she was offering me a chance to back down before the trial, a private opportunity to be persuaded or pressured or guilted into dropping the case before it could damage her publicly. What she was actually offering, Ted said, was a chance to say out loud, without a lawyer present and without the careful management that a courtroom imposes, exactly who she was and what she wanted. People like Renata, he said, do not do well with silence. They need a response to perform against. If you give her nothing, she will eventually fill the silence herself, and what she fills it with will belong to us. He held up the small digital recorder he had already selected for the occasion, slim enough to disappear into a jacket pocket. She wants to meet in a park. Public space, no recordings, just family. She will have planned every word. He set the recorder on the table. We will plan the space. The meeting was set for the following Saturday morning at Riverside Park, a stretch of walkways and wooden benches along the water on the east side of town. Dot and I had walked there on Sunday mornings for years, feeding the ducks near the fountain, in the good seasons, sitting on the bench closest to the water, and talking about nothing in particular, the way people do when they are comfortable. Enough with each other to let silence have its share of the conversation. Ted and two of his law clerks arrived an hour before I did and positioned themselves behind a cluster of oak trees, 20 yards back from the bench, where I would sit close enough to hear clearly, far enough to be invisible. I carried the recorder in my left jacket pocket, already running. I sat down on the bench and looked at the fountain and waited. She arrived 10 minutes late, which I suspected was intentional, and the woman who walked toward me across the park path bore very little surface resemblance to the woman I had last seen screaming in a hospital lobby. She was wearing a soft lavender dress, and her hair was pulled back simply the way she had worn it as a teenager, and her makeup was minimal in a way that was clearly considered. She looked younger and softer, and somehow diminished. And she was wearing the same perfume Dot had worn, which I did not think was an accident. She sat down beside me and folded her hands in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice had a practiced fragility to it, a carefully calibrated tremor. She said she was sorry. She said she had been under enormous pressure, and that Conrad had pushed her into decisions she would never have made alone. She said she had been terrified of losing me the way she had lost her mother, that fear had made her irrational, that she could see now how everything had looked from my side, and it was not what she had intended. She took my hand. "I love you," she said. "You're my father. That is never going to change. We can stop all of this right now, drop the legal proceedings, go back to being a family. Just give me the chance to make this right." I said nothing. I looked at her the way I had sometimes looked at her when she was small and had been caught in a lie she hadn't fully committed to, a level and patient look that asked nothing and offered nothing, that simply waited. Her eyes moved across my face, searching for a foothold, and found none. She tried again, a slightly different version of the same appeal, and I listened to it with the same expression. The silence between us grew, and she began to fill it the way Ted had said she would, with smaller and sharper things, irritation bleeding through the performance in increments she couldn't fully control. She said I had always been stubborn. She said I had never made things easy for anyone. She said the money had been sitting untouched for years while her family struggled, and I had never once offered to help. Each sentence arrived with more edge than the last, the careful softness peeling back in layers, and I watched it happen without intervening. Then, something gave way entirely. "You want the truth." Her voice had shed every last trace of the performance she had prepared. "You have been a burden since Mom died. You are sitting on everything she left behind, and you have done nothing with it, and you will leave it to strangers before you leave it to your own blood." She was standing now, her hands rigid at her sides, and people on nearby paths had slowed to watch. "All you had to do was sign the papers. All you had to do was die quietly like you were supposed to. And instead, you have dragged this out and cost us everything." Her voice had reached the register where it no longer sounded like a plan, only like a wound, and the words she was saying were the truest things she had said to me in years. Ted stepped out from behind the oak trees, followed by his two clerks. Renata saw them, and then she saw the recorder I had drawn from my jacket pocket, the red light still blinking steadily. The color left her face in a single clean motion. She looked at the recorder, then at Ted, then at me. "You think this is over," she said, her voice gone quiet and precise, in a way that was somehow worse than the screaming. "I have one card left to play, and when I play it, it is going to destroy you." She turned and walked to the parking lot without looking back. 3 weeks later, I sat down at the plaintiff's table in the courtroom of Judge Claire Whitmore, and the door on the far side of the room opened, and Renata walked in wearing a conservative navy suit with her hair perfectly arranged, moving with the measured composure of a woman who had spent 3 weeks preparing the performance of her life. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected and more crowded than I had prepared myself for. Every seat in the public gallery was filled neighbors from Maple Ridge, familiar faces from the senior center, people I recognized from 40 years of ordinary life in this town, all of them present in the particular silence that courtrooms assonance produce, the collective held breath of people who have come to see what truth looks like when it is forced into the open. I recognized the librarian who had helped Dot find her gardening books for years. I recognized the couple from 2 streets over who had waved at us from their driveway on 1,000 ordinary mornings. They had come because word had traveled the way word travels in small places, and because a 72-year-old retired postal worker taking his own daughter to court for elder abuse was not the kind of story people stayed home for. Judge Claire Whitmore entered and the room stood, and when she settled into her chair, she had the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years watching people perform versions of themselves in her courtroom and could identify the performance from the first syllable. Renata took the stand mid-morning, and what followed was the most controlled and technically accomplished thing I had ever watched her do. Her voice carried just enough emotion to signal genuine distress without tipping into anything that could be called theatrical. She described rushing to the hospital in terror, described the confusion and helplessness of watching a parent decline, described the fear of making wrong decisions under impossible pressure. She wept at the right moments, briefly and without excess, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had folded precisely in her palm. She said Conrad had acted without her knowledge, that she had been horrified when she discovered what he had done, that she had never intended any harm, and had only ever wanted to ensure her father was properly cared for. She looked at the jury with an expression of wounded sincerity that I recognized because I had believed it myself for most of her adult life. 2 of the jurors were leaning slightly toward her. One older woman in the second row had her hand pressed to her collarbone. Then Ted stood up and the temperature in the room shifted by several degrees. He had never been a lawyer who raised his voice or reached for drama. His method was accumulation, building a structure so precise and so complete that there was nowhere left for the other side to stand by the time he finished. He started with the video. The courtroom monitor came to life, and there was Bria, 15 years old, dancing in my living room. And there in the kitchen doorway behind her was Renata with both hands extended, pushing me backward into the counter with full and deliberate force. Several jurors visibly recoiled. The older woman who had been leaning toward Renata sat back in her chair. Ted let the video play to its end before he said a word, letting the silence do its portion of the work. Then came the hospital recording, Renata's voice moving through the courtroom like a cold current, discussing the value of my house and my accounts and my life insurance with the calm efficiency of someone reading a balance sheet. He presented the financial records showing that she had accessed my email account and my investment correspondence while I lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. He called Cecile to the stand, and she testified with the same steady, unshakable quality she had brought to every moment of this ordeal, describing Renata's efforts to restrict my medical information and the incident with Conrad and the forged transfer papers in language so specific and so detailed that Bennett Shaw, Renata's young attorney, objected 3 times in 10 minutes and was overruled each time. Dr. Sandra Elmore, Ted's expert witness, explained to the jury in plain and methodical terms how the pattern of behavior documented in this case aligned precisely with established clinical definitions of elder financial exploitation. And she used the word systematic twice, and each time she used it I watched the word land on the faces of the people in the jury box. By the time Ted indicated he was pausing his presentation, Renata's hands were flat on the defense table and her jaw was set in the way it's set when she was containing something large. Her lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly to her, and she gave a short, rigid nod that suggested she was hearing his words without receiving them. Then she did something that Bennett Shaw clearly had not been told she was going to do. She stood up. Not quickly and not wildly, but with a deliberateness that drew every eye in the room before she had spoken a single syllable. Judge Whitmore looked up from her notes. "Your Honor," Renata said, and her voice had returned to that controlled register she had been performing from all morning, though underneath it now there was something else, something compressed and pressurized. "I have evidence that has not yet been presented to this court. Evidence that changes the nature of everything you have heard in this room today." She paused. "Evidence that my father was responsible for my mother's death." The room produced a sound I can only describe as a collective intake of breath, sudden and involuntary, the sound of a space full of people encountering something they had not accounted for. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down once, firmly demanding order. From her bag, Renata produced an envelope, old and slightly yellowed, and held it up for the room to see. The bailiff carried it to the judge, who examined it briefly and then passed it to Ted. I watched my old friend open the envelope and remove the letter inside and begin to read, and I watched the color leave his face in a slow and terrible progression, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held something I had not seen in them before, and it was close enough to fear that my chest went tight before I had read a single word. Ted set the letter on the table between us and angled it so I could read it without picking it up. And I read it the way you read something that carries your wife's handwriting in a sentence that makes no sense to you at first, and then makes a terrible kind of sense once the context assembles itself. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, and the writing had the quality of something set down quickly, in the compressed and urgent hand Dot used when she was working through something difficult. It said she was afraid. It said I had become controlling and angry in ways that frightened her. It said that one night when she had chest pains and asked me to call for help, I had told her she was being dramatic and wasting money, and that by the time I finally made the call it had been too late for the moment she had needed me most. It said that if something happened to her, I was the reason. I remembered the night she was describing. I remembered it completely and without ambiguity, because it was one of those domestic incidents that lodges in memory, not for drama but for relief, for the slightly embarrassed relief of a scare that turned out to be nothing. Dot had woken around midnight with what she described as pressure in her chest, and I had suggested we wait a few minutes and see whether it passed, because we had eaten a heavy dinner, and her pattern with acid reflux was familiar to us both after decades of marriage. When the discomfort didn't ease, I called the paramedics immediately within 20 minutes of her first mentioning it. They arrived, assessed her, and told us it was gastric reflux. We had laughed about it the following morning over coffee, gently in the way couples laugh at the small alarms of getting older. That was what I remembered. That was what had actually happened. But reading what Dot had written in the hours after that night, reading the fear she had felt in the dark while she was waiting, and did not know yet that it would resolve into something ordinary, I understood something I had not considered before. She had been frightened in a way I had not perceived, in a way she had not shown me after the fact. And the words she had put on paper in that private, frightened hour were words that captured something real about that fear, even if they did not capture the full truth of what had passed between us. She had written them, and then apparently she had not sent them. She had thrown them away. Someone had taken them out of the trash. Ted requested an immediate recess and forensic examination of the document before it could be entered as evidence, and Judge Whitmore granted it. The afternoon session was suspended until the following morning, and a court-appointed document examiner named Raymond Fossey was assigned to conduct the analysis overnight. Ted arranged for his own independent review to run concurrently both examinations to report before the court reconvened. He spoke quietly to me in the corridor outside the courtroom and told me to go home and sleep, which was advice he had to know I was not going to take. Bennett Shaw had stood before the jury that afternoon and told them the letter demonstrated a pattern of neglect and control that reframed every piece of evidence they had already heard, and I had watched the older woman in the second row move her hand from her collarbone to her mouth, and I had watched two jurors exchange a glance that contained more doubt than anything I wanted to see in that room. The house was quiet when I got home. Bria was at a school event she had refused to cancel because normalcy was the thing she was holding on to with both hands those weeks, and Darnell had left dinner on the stove and gone to give me the particular gift of solitude that people give when they understand it is what you actually need. I sat at the kitchen table with the untouched plate in front of me, and I did not eat. I held the photograph from our wedding that lived on the bookshelf beside the kitchen door, Dot in the dress she had made herself, because she had wanted it to be exactly right, her eyes doing the thing they did when she was happiest, lit from somewhere behind them. And I asked her aloud to the empty kitchen and the ticking clock and the dark window whether she had actually been afraid of me, whether there had been a version of our life together that I had not understood, whether the man she had protected with such careful and elaborate love had also been in some way a man she needed protecting from. I did not have an answer, and the kitchen did not offer one. I sat with the question because it was there and because I had too much respect for Dot to dismiss it out of hand just because it was painful. If she had written it, she had felt it. Even if only for one night, even if only in the dark. That mattered. I was still at the table when my phone showed a text from Ted at midnight. Fosse is working. 2 things already. Call you at 7. I set the phone face down and finally ate the cold dinner and went to bed and lay awake until sometime around 4 in the morning when exhaustion finally made the decision that my mind had been refusing to make. The courtroom the next morning was even quieter than it had been the day before. The quality of silence that fills a space when everyone present understands that something definitive is about to happen. Raymond Fosse was a slight man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, economical movements of someone who spends most of his professional life examining things at very close range. He placed a series of enlarged photographs on the display stand beside the witness box, adjusted them with unhurried precision, and looked at the jury with the expression of a man who has found something and intends to explain it completely. Your Honor, he said, I have conducted a thorough analysis of the documents submitted to this court yesterday afternoon. Several critical findings have emerged. Raymond Fosse pointed to the first enlarged photograph, and the courtroom leaned forward in the collective and involuntary way of people who sense that what they are about to hear will require their full attention. The photograph showed the edges of the letter magnified to the point where every fiber of the paper was visible. Observe the margins on the left side of the document, he said. The paper has been torn, not cut. The tearing is irregular and shows the kind of stress pattern consistent with a page being ripped from a larger collection of sheets, a journal, a notepad, or a bound writing book. This document was physically separated from other material by hand at some point prior to its presentation to this court. He moved to the second photograph, an image of the paper surface under magnification that showed something I would not have known to look for on my own. Ink chromatography and paper fiber analysis place the manufacturing origin of both the ink and the paper stock within a batch produced between 2016 and 2019. Cross-referencing with documented correspondence in the case file, this time frame is consistent with a period when Mr. and Mrs. Morse experienced a specific and recorded disagreement related to a nighttime medical event, the same event described in the letter itself. He paused, and the room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system above the ceiling. Third, and most significantly, he looked at the jury directly. This document contains no signature, no date, no salutation, and no closing. The text ends in the middle of a sentence mid-page with the remainder of the page left entirely blank. In my professional experience, a letter written with the intent of being preserved, sent, or used as a record is completed before it is kept. This document was not completed. It was abandoned. He set down his pointer and addressed Judge Whitmore with the even unhurried certainty of someone delivering a conclusion they have stress-tested from every available angle. It is my professional opinion that this document is a fragment of a private journal entry or an unsent letter drafted during a moment of acute emotional distress and subsequently discarded by the author. It was retrieved from a waste receptacle at some point after it was thrown away and has been preserved in that incomplete state almost certainly without the knowledge or consent of the person who wrote it. It was never intended to be seen. It was never intended to be used. And it does not represent the considered or final position of the person whose handwriting it bears. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it, the silence of a room full of people processing a recalibration. The older woman in the second juror row, who had covered her mouth the day before, was now looking at Renata with an expression that had moved well past sympathy into something considerably colder. Judge Whitmore removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench in front of her, and looked at Renata for a long moment before she spoke. "Counselor," she said to Bennett Shaw, and the single word carried enough controlled weight to serve as its own paragraph. "Your client has presented to this court a document retrieved from a trash receptacle, authored in a moment of private distress, never completed, never sent, and never intended for any audience, and she has presented it as evidence of criminal conduct by the plaintiff. This court takes a very serious view of that choice. Shaw was on his feet with an objection that went nowhere. Renata sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes forward, and the stillness of someone who is holding themselves together through the sheer mechanical effort of not moving. It was at that point, while Shaw was still constructing a response, he clearly did not believe in that there was movement in the gallery. Conrad, sitting in the public rows in his county-issued clothing, with an officer on either side of him, rose to his feet. The officer to his left put a hand on his arm, and he shook his head slightly, and the officer after a moment allowed it. "Your Honor," Conrad said, and his voice in that room was the voice of a man who has decided that the only exit left to him is forward. "I need to address something about that letter. I know where it came from." Judge Whitmore studied him for a moment, then looked at both attorneys, then gestured to the bailiff. Conrad was brought to the witness stand and sworn in, and Ted was on his feet before Shaw could organize a protest. What Conrad described was not complicated in its facts, only in what the facts revealed. 3 years ago, shortly after Dot's funeral, Renata had gone through the boxes of her mother's personal effects that I had placed in the spare room. In one of those boxes she found a small wastebasket that had not been emptied, and inside it she found several crumpled and discarded papers, drafts of letters and journal fragments that Dot had written and thrown away. Renata had smoothed them out and read them. She had selected the most damaging passages and placed them in an envelope she labeled in Conrad's words, "Insurance." "She told me if you ever fought back," Conrad said, looking at me rather than at the jury, "she would use them to destroy your reputation." Ted let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds, then moved to the next item in his hand, a phone with a bank document displayed on the screen. Renata had maintained a private account at Coastal Heritage Credit Union for years, unknown to anyone, in her declared financial records built from transfers she had made in small increments from Agnes Hartley's accounts in the final years of the older woman's life, amount small enough, individually, to avoid scrutiny, totaling $85,000. Then Ted moved to the text messages, and when he put them on the courtroom monitor, 2 jurors stopped breathing for a visible moment. The exchange was dated 14 months before my stroke. Renata had written to Conrad that when I was finally gone, their real life would begin, that she was tired of performing care for a man she had been waiting on for years. Conrad had asked what she meant by speeding things along, and Renata had answered in the precise and unambiguous words now illuminated in that courtroom for every person present to read at the same time. "Accidents happen to old people all the time." The words stayed on the monitor long enough for every person in that courtroom to read them twice. I watched the jury. I had been watching them for 2 days, with the particular attention of someone who understands that 12 strangers hold the weight of everything, and what I saw moving across their faces now was not the careful neutrality that jury instructions ask for. It was the specific and personal revulsion that ordinary people feel when cruelty is made undeniable. The older woman in the second row had her hand pressed flat against the jury box railing, as though she needed something solid. A man near the end of the front row had stopped writing in his notepad entirely and was simply staring at the screen. Ted let the silence extend to its natural limit, and then he turned back to Conrad and asked him to continue. Conrad had transferred his cooperation to the prosecution in full, and the remaining portion of his testimony had the quality of a structure being taken apart, piece by piece, by someone who helped build it and now understood it needed to come down. He described how Renata had accessed Dot's bank accounts using passwords she had obtained before Dot's death, and how in the weeks following the funeral she had transferred $40,000 out of those accounts under the stated justification of funeral expenses. The funeral had cost $8,000. The remaining $32,000 had gone into the private account at Coastal Heritage that Conrad had already described, added to the money that had been building there for years in increments taken from Agnes Hartley's estate. He described conversations in which Renata had spoken about my health with the detached analytical interest of someone monitoring an investment, calculating timelines, discussing what would need to happen and in what order when the moment arrived. He described being shown once a folder she kept in the back of her desk drawer that contained documents she had collected over years, financial records, fragments of correspondence, things she had held on to against the possibility that she might someday need ammunition. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I did not move and I did not look away from the witness stand because looking away felt like a concession I was not willing to make. 6 months before my stroke, Renata had been writing to her husband about the end of my life as though it were a scheduled event, something coming on the calendar that required advance planning. 14 months before my stroke, she had been considering how to accelerate that schedule. I had been in my garden 6 months ago. I had been playing chess at the senior center and tending Dot's flower beds and learning slowly how to cook for one. I had been alive and ordinary and entirely unaware that my daughter was measuring the distance between my current state and her desired outcome. Ted indicated he had no further questions. Bennett Shaw rose for cross-examination and attempted 3 different angles in rapid succession, implying Conrad's testimony was self-serving, suggesting the text messages had been taken out of context, proposing an alternate reading of the private account that involved inheritance, planning rather than theft. Conrad answered each attempt with the flat, deflating patience of a man who had already decided that the only version of this he could live with was the true one, and none of Shaw's angles produced anything that altered the fundamental shape of what the jury had now heard. Shaw sat down and the room settled, and Judge Whitmore was drawing breath to speak when the sound of a chair being shoved back cut across the courtroom like something dropped from a height. Renata was on her feet. Not in the measured, deliberate way she had stood the previous day when she introduced the letter. She was simply suddenly standing, the chair displaced behind her, and the composure she had maintained across 2 days of testimony was gone in its entirety. What was underneath it was not grief and was not fear. It was rage of the particular kind that has been compressed for a long time under a great deal of pressure and has finally found the path of least resistance. She looked at Conrad, and what came out of her was not a sentence so much as a release loud enough to reach every corner of the room, raw in a way that no amount of preparation could have produced or prevented. She called him a coward. She called him a traitor. She told the jury he had wanted the money as badly as she had, and was performing virtue only because he had been caught and had nowhere else to go. She turned to the gallery with the wild, sweeping look of someone who needs witnesses and cannot stop herself from demanding them. Then she saw Bria sitting in the public rows with her hands gripping the railing, her face wet and utterly still, and something in Renata shifted from rage into something uglier and more specific. She said things to her daughter that I will not repeat here, things that belong to the category of words that cannot be unheard once they have been said. Things that told me more clearly than anything else in those 2 days exactly what Bria had been living with for years. 2 court officers were moving toward Renata before she finished the sentence. She turned on them and then turned back to the room with her arms spread wide, her hair loose from its arrangement, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she was trying to say at once. "I deserve that money," she said. "I have always deserved it. Everything he has should be mine. After everything I did, after everything I waited for, it should be mine." The officers had her by both arms, and she was not going quietly, and the judge's gavel was coming down repeatedly, and still Renata's voice carried over all of it until the officers finally got her seated and held her there by force, trembling, and spent her makeup, destroyed her performance. In ruins, every mask she had ever worn, stripped away in front of the 12 people who were about to decide her future. Judge Whitmore waited until the room was completely still. Then she removed her glasses and set them down with a finality that required no elaboration. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, she said. "When I return, I will render my judgment." Bria had climbed over the gallery railing and crossed the floor to where I sat, and she took my hand in both of hers and held it without speaking. I held hers back. The clock on the wall marked each second with the same indifferent patience it had been marking them all morning, and the 15 minutes that followed were the longest I had spent since the night I lay in a hospital bed, unable to move, listening to my own daughter plan her inheritance. Judge Whitmore came back into the courtroom at exactly the 15-minute mark, and the room rose and resettled in the hushed collective way of people who understand that what is about to happen has the weight of something final. She arranged her papers, put on her reading glasses, and looked at Renata for a long moment before she spoke, the look of someone who has seen a great deal in 20 years on the bench and has not made peace with any of it, only learned to carry it with precision. Renata stood on instruction, her attorney beside her, and she was quieter now than she had been at any point in the preceding 2 days, the particular quiet of someone whose energy has been entirely spent. Judge Whitmore read the charges and the findings in the even authoritative cadence that courtrooms require, and each count landed in the room with its own separate weight. Elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, forgery of medical documents, perjury, conspiracy to commit theft. Then she set the paper down and spoke without reading directly and without the insulation of formal language. She said that in 20 years on the bench, she had rarely encountered a case in which the calculation behind the cruelty was so sustained and so deliberate. She said that Renata had not acted in panic or desperation, but had planned across years, had practiced her methods on elderly family members before refining them, had recruited her own teenage daughter into criminal activity, and had stood in a courtroom and attempted to weaponize her mother's most private and discarded fears as a tool of destruction. She said there had been no genuine remorse at any point in the proceedings, only the management of appearances, and that the outburst the court had witnessed that morning was the most honest thing Renata had shown them, because it had revealed not a woman driven by love or fear, but a woman driven by entitlement so absolute it could not survive contact with accountability. The sentence was 2 years in county jail, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service to be completed at an elder care facility of the court's choosing, a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me or with Bria, full restitution of all legal costs, and the $125,000 taken from Agnes Hartley's and Dot's estates over the years, and a permanent bar from any future inheritance rights to my estate, with my revocable living trust naming Bria as primary beneficiary declared valid and legally binding by order of the court, with Ted appointed as co-trustee until Bria reached the age of 25. Conrad received 1 year in county jail and 3 years probation, with his own portion of restitution attached in recognition of his cooperation and the material difference it had made to the outcome. The gavel came down and the sound of it moved through me like something being set down after a very long time of carrying it. Bria's arms were around my neck before the echo had finished. Ted gripped my hand across the table, his eyes doing what the eyes of composed men do when they have been holding something in for too long. Cecile had come down from the gallery and was standing just inside the railing with one hand pressed to her chest, and when our eyes met, she gave a single slow nod that communicated more than a conversation could have managed. I watched the officers lead Renata toward the side door, and she turned back once as I had known she would, and looked at me across the length of the courtroom. I had expected to see hatred in that look or defiance, and I found I had prepared myself to receive either. What I saw instead was emptiness, a blankness so complete it was almost worse than anger. The look of someone who has hollowed themselves out in pursuit of something that is no longer available and has not yet understood what to do with the space that remains. I turned away. There was nothing left in that direction for me. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of what had been the spare room and watched Bria arrange her brushes and paints on the shelving that Ted and I had built and installed on a Saturday afternoon the week before. We had painted the walls a warm cream and hung proper lighting and positioned an easel near the window that caught the full run of afternoon sun. The room smelled of fresh paint and of the particular possibility that belongs to spaces being used for the first time for something they were meant for. Bria stepped back to look at the arrangement with her head tilted and her hands on her hips, which was a gesture so precisely Dot's that it stopped my breath for just a moment. She asked me what I thought. I told her I thought her grandmother would have been proud, and I meant it in more than one direction. She had been living with me since the month after the trial with the court's approval and the full support of her school counselor, and I had watched her unwind slowly and steadily from the tightened and frightened thing she had been into something more like herself, something braver and cleaner, and more honest than the girl who had appeared on my porch with her backpack and her guilt. She had changed schools for the fresh start, and her art teacher had already called me twice. She was working on a series of paintings she called Second Chances. Pairs of people, old and young together, their faces turned toward each other with something open in them. The doorbell rang, and I knew before I checked who it would be. Cecile came twice a week now, sometimes with dinner, sometimes only to sit on the porch as the evening settled around us and talk about nothing that required resolution. She was not a replacement for Dot, and neither of us had ever pretended otherwise. She was something that had its own name, a companion who had lived long enough to understand loss and had chosen in full knowledge of its cost to keep reaching toward people anyway. I told her once that Dot would have liked her, and she said she knew that Dot had told her so herself, and we both laughed at that, the way you laugh when something is both funny and completely true. That Sunday morning, I stood on the front porch with my coffee while the sun came up over the neighborhood, the same roofline and oak trees I had looked at for 40 years, and the birds were doing what birds do at first light. Inside, Bria was still asleep. The street was quiet. I looked up at the pale morning sky the way I had found myself looking up at it more and more in the months since the trial. Not with grief, exactly. More with the particular attention you give to someone who is not present but is not entirely absent either. I said what I needed to say quietly to the sky and the early light and wherever Dot was in relation to either of those things. I told her that the family she had spent the last years of her life trying to protect was safe. I told her that Bria had her own room with good light and was going to be extraordinary. I told her that I was still standing. Cecile's car pulled up to the curb and she got out carrying a bag from the bakery we both liked, and she said, "Good morning," in the quiet way she had, and I said it back, and we went inside together into the warmth of the house, and I closed the door gently behind us, and outside, the sun finished rising and the street filled with ordinary light, and the darkness for the first time in a very long time stayed where it belonged. If this story stayed with you, I want you to know that it stayed with me too, and not just because of the betrayal or the courtroom or the moments that made your chest tighten. What I keep coming back to is Dot, a woman who saw what was coming, who could not stop it alone, and who spent her final years quietly arranging protection for the person she loved most. She did not rage. She did not give up. She planned with whatever time and strength she had left, and because she did, Elliot survived. That is the part of this story I want you to carry with you. Now here is what I believe this story is asking all of us to do. Pay attention to the people around you who are aging, your parents, your neighbors, the people in your life who are becoming more dependent and more vulnerable, because the warning signs of elder financial abuse are almost always visible before the damage becomes irreparable. Listen when an elderly person expresses fear about a family member. Even if the fear sounds small, do not dismiss it as confusion or paranoia. If you are the elderly person in this story, please do not wait until you are in a hospital bed to put legal protections in place. A revocable living trust, a durable power of attorney with someone you genuinely trust, an advance healthcare directive, these are not documents for dying. They are documents for living with dignity and security on your own terms. And if something feels wrong, say it out loud. Elliot survived because one nurse refused to stay silent. You deserve that same protection. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. It matters that you did.